Hello, everyone. Welcome to this webinar. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending on where you're from. I'm Charlene Rajendran, and I'm the moderator for this session. Happy to welcome you to Statistically Speaking, Analyzing Arts Audiences' Engagement in Singapore and Australia. This is a webinar in which representatives from Singapore's National Arts Council, the NAC, and the Australia Council for the Arts will discuss audience attitudes towards the arts in their respective countries based on research survey data that has been collected in 2019 and 2020. So what we're looking at is how this data tells us something about ourselves, about the landscapes in which the arts is created and responded to, and how this effectively makes a difference in new policy and program planning for both these countries. What does it say about the future of the arts? So big questions in a relatively short period of time. The webinar is organized by Arts Equator and supported by National Arts Council Singapore and Australia Council for the Arts. And it is part of the Singapore Art Week 2021, which is ongoing if you happen to be in Singapore and aren't aware of this. For those of you who are here in a particular capacity, we hope that you will perhaps share this information with others. The event is going to be recorded and it will be made available as a video on Arts Equator's YouTube channel after the event. We're sorry for starting a little bit late. There are some tech issues. Life is still not as per normal. We are still working under strange circumstances, which is why we're not all seated in one room together, but in different parts of the world and different parts of the cities where we live in as well. The structure of the session is such that for the first 30 minutes, half an hour or so, we will be in discussion with Chris Hope and Sharon Chung, who will be speaking specifically about the material that emerged from the surveys that they have been largely responsible for conducting. And then we will invite Tong and Jade Lillie, who are involved in sector development, to join us for the discussion for about 25 minutes or so. After that, there will be opportunities for questions that you may have to be responded to by the panel. And for this, we invite you to use the Q&A feature at the bottom of the screen to submit questions at any time. They can be questions directed specifically to a member of the panel, or they can be generic questions, comments that you feel you want to add to the discussion and invite a response to. You've been watching some infographics that are particular data points that have been extracted from these two survey reports. And this information will be available to you through the webinar. There's a link, and this link will be made available on the chat right now and on screen, that you can access this material in case you want to refer to some of the details that you saw just now and can't remember, right? Now, these are comparable data points from reports as indicated, but they obviously aren't the full extent of what these reports do, so just bear that in mind. Okay, so let me invite Dr. Sharon Chung and Chris Pope to turn on their screens, and I will briefly introduce them. They are both researchers with varied backgrounds. Dr. Sharon Chung is concurrently the Research Director of the Culture Academy, Ministry of Culture, Community and Youth, as well as the Chief Research Officer at the National Arts Council in Singapore. She's done a range of different things and been an economist in a different life. Perhaps she still is an economist in this life, but with a different garb, perhaps. Chris Pope is Research Program Manager at the Australia Council for the Arts, and Chris's current role combines his passion for the arts and research and delivering valuable insights on topics such as audience engagement, artist careers, arts tourism, has been involved in looking at particular sectors such as health and education. Welcome to you both. I hope you're both well, over and above everything else.
Safe and well.
Safe and well, that's good. Sharon's in Singapore, Chris is in Sydney, I'm in Singapore as well. Now, the purpose of having this session was to make accessible some of the material that emerges in the research survey that you have both conducted. This is not the first time the survey is being conducted, and of course, the results are coming out at a time when some of it may feel very strange because we are now living through a pandemic. And the survey was done before this period of time. And so there is that calibration that needs to be made. But nonetheless, it does offer valuable insights into what is going on, what has been happening, responses to policy and programs that have been devised in both instances. So to begin, I'm going to ask you both, separately of course, to give us an idea about what were the primary goals when conducting the research and briefly describe or explain the methodologies chosen to gain this information and what were your primary responses to it. So Sharon, I believe you're going to begin. Over to you.
Right. Thank you, Charlene. So I'm going to talk about the two immediate surveys or most recent past, which is the population survey on the arts, as well as the special series that we ran during the COVID period. So starting with the POP survey. So part of the National Arts Council's mission is to make arts an integral part of the lives of Singaporeans, or if you would, life in Singapore. So over the last 2 decades, we have been conducting the population survey to better understand the progress that we have made on this front, really to understand how people in Singapore perceive the arts and how involved they are in arts and culture activities. Well, we used to run it once every 3 years, but seeing how much faster life and lifestyles are changing, we currently do it biannually. Well, it's not still as quick as we would like to have it, but cost considerations. So the underlying construct of this survey is a simple one, which is what the brain knows and what the heart feels will ultimately drive what the hands do and where the legs go. So therefore, the survey looks at attitudes and perceptions towards arts and culture, people's declared innate interest in arts and culture, as well as their engagement with arts, both in terms of live attendance as well as online or digital participation. So as Charlene had noted earlier, this helps to provide government, arts practitioners, as well as people in industry with insights for policy, program, as well as product development. So the data collection for the population survey is a standard one, as in most surveys around household surveys around the world. For us, we approach 2,000 Singapore citizens and permanent residents. They are randomly selected from a sampling framework provided by our National Statistical Authority, and they are representative of the population distribution in terms of age, 15 years and above, gender, ethnicity, housing type as proxy for income, as well as geographical spread. So our interviews for us, because we are a small country, are conducted door to door by trained interviewers. And because we are a multilingual country, interviews are conducted in either English, Chinese, Malay, or Tamil, our main languages, or according to the preferences of respondents. So over the last 20 years that we've conducted this, technical approach has not been changed, but what have been modified is additional questions to track new determinants of either people's interest and people's engagement, as well as the outcomes of people's participation in the arts. We've also tweaked certain there's some wording of the questions for greater clarity, but by and large, over the 2 decades, it is a continuous distribution. So in 2020, we ran additional survey series, as I mentioned. We wanted really to understand how this whole pandemic thing and the lockdown especially has affected people's consumption of the arts. I mean, basically, we were all restricted to just consuming arts via digital means. So did that make them, more open to the arts, or did they turn them off to other entertainment things? This is what we tried to understand. So for this second series, we had full surveys of 500 people asked about what they did for the last 2 weeks in terms of art and heritage engagement. And there were 3 full surveys, and there are 9 other sort of like dipstick polls in between. That's how we try to keep track of how arts is being used or consumed or benefiting people during this period. Chris, over to you.
Thanks, Sharon, and hello everyone. It's nice to be joining you today in this session. I'm currently at the Australia Council office in Sydney, and I'd like to begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land from which I'm coming to you today, the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation. I pay my respects to elders, both past and present. So in terms of our National Arts Participation Survey here in Australia, I suppose I'll just talk about why it's important generally, and then why it's important now in the context of the pandemic. So there's a number of reasons why it's important. It paints a comprehensive picture of Australians' evolving relationship with the arts. It allows us to track trends in arts engagement across all art forms. And importantly, it arms the arts sector with information on audiences and markets, providing insights into growth opportunities, and importantly for us, demonstrates the social, cultural and economic value of the arts in Australia. Like all of our research, it really builds the evidence base for the arts and helps to ensure there's informed conversations about the arts in Australia. So it's particularly important now as well, because things have changed so much, as Sharon just alluded to. Our survey was conducted in late 2019. So that was immediately prior to devastating bushfires in Australia, and obviously before the pandemic hit our shores as well. So we feel these results provide important insights as our nation works towards recovery, really. And it sits alongside some of our other research, which I'll touch on throughout the session in terms of our COVID-19 impacts research. That highlights the crucial role of arts and creativity, both pre-pandemic and throughout the challenges of the last year and the challenges we still face now. And importantly in our study as well, I think it's important to acknowledge in the context of the global Black Lives Matter movement. These results provide really important insights and information about diverse voices in Australia and the centrality of First Nations arts in Australia's culture. So how did we do it? I'll talk a little bit now about the methodology, as briefly as I can. This is the 4th edition in this research series, building on the previous research, which was conducted in 2009, 2013, and 2016. The survey is really broad in scope and covers a range of arts offerings in Australia, including commercial and not-for-profit activity, amateur and professional activities, and in-person and online engagement and experiences. We have a nationally representative sample, so there's 9,000 people aged 15 and over, and that's representative based on age, gender, state, territory, and location, so metro or regional hubs. A change a change in 2019 in terms of methodology for us was moving the study entirely online. So in previous studies, it was a mix of telephone and online surveys, and we sort of foreshadowed this in 2016 by conducting the majority of the 2016 study online with the full migration inevitable at some stage. So we decided to sort of move in that direction this time. So the entire study is now online. So that impacts trends somewhat. So some trends have to be interpreted with caution because of that methodological change. Because of that, also we wanted to look at some priorities for us, and lab decided us to look at younger people in more detail, so those aged 15 to 24. So we could have more detailed analysis of specific age groups within that 15 to 24 age bracket. And we also worked with specialist partners to boost representation of other priority groups and communities who may be unlikely to be well represented in online surveys. So that included first regional and remote First Nations communities. We engaged First Nations researchers to undertake the survey in specific communities across the country. And as Australia has one of the most culturally and linguistically diverse populations in the world, we thought it was important to translate the survey into certain languages. So we discussed various language groups, emerging and established language groups in Australia, and the survey was translated into 6 language groups, and we ran this through with a multicultural marketing agency. And those languages were Arabic, Dinka, Mandarin, Spanish, Urdu, and Vietnamese. So that allowed us to look into those language groups in a bit more detail. And we also worked with another disability partner to boost the sample of Australians with intellectual disability this time. In terms of outputs, we have the main report and a suite of resources on the website, but we have also brought together findings under Spotlight. So there's Spotlight sections within the main report, and these can also be read as standalone documents as well. So they're fairly brief summaries touching on important priority areas for us. And there's 4 of these Spotlight sections, and I'll just quickly run through what they are. So there's a real emphasis on economic value and future success here. So the results show us the role in child development, education, local economies and tourism, and skills for the future. The second one is around building social cohesion. So that sense of community and connection and celebrating our diversity through the arts can bridge some social divides. Third is around health and well-being. So meeting challenges of loneliness and isolation and mental health. We can see the results really speak to that as well. And the last one, which is, subject to some more investigation that we're doing coming up in the next few months, is ensuring equal access to the benefits of arts and creativity for all Australians. So that's a really key point in terms of some perhaps socio-economic inequalities that we've discovered, and ongoing work will continue to address that. That's a fairly brief of our.
Thank you. I realize it's hard to condense so much information that you've both been working with and processing into a short period of time. But nonetheless, that gives us an idea of some of the challenges involved in not just designing the methodologies and the scope, but also coping with change. Human beings are changing, the planet is changing, and therefore these discourses are going to be changing. Nonetheless, if we could take on some of the specific data that has emerged and look at the fact that there has been an increase in participation and in engagement in both Australia and Singapore. Now, I'm completely aware that to compare these 2 countries is in one sense bizarre and strange. One is a city-state, and while both are islands, the scale and scope and the magnitude of it is really quite different, because of course Australia has got many different states, and each state also has particular dynamics that need to be factored into the understanding, and the kinds of diversities in both these spaces are also particular to their histories, etc. Nonetheless, there has been an increase, and I'd like to ask you to speak to how you understand that particular increase and how it links with the perceptions that have been also captured in the surveys, perceptions that have been captured via different statements that both surveys put out for people to respond to. So Sharon, if we could begin with you.
Oh, thanks, Charlene. Okay, so let me start with the population survey. Um, 2019 was a good year for us, statistically speaking, for the arts. The physical attendance of arts events is the second highest observed since the commencement of the survey. What lies beneath? This increase in attendance was driven, if you just look at the data for that year, by attendance of heritage activities. It's like 40% of the population said they had been to at least one heritage activity. And reading, 41%. Singaporeans are now starting to be like the British. So we think that the arts events and exhibitions related for us in Singapore to the bicentennial celebrations that we had at the end of 2019. This was a really big thing, and everyone was, hyped up to go to attend at least one exhibition or one art event related to that. So that could have sparked not just attendance, but that could spark a longer term interest in arts. And we realized this from the data over all the years that really perceptions and attitudes do drive attendance, but not completely. So while we have like 80 to 90, I can talk a little bit about that later, 80 to 90% of people recognize that arts is good for them individually, it's good for them as a community, it's good for the country, but only about like 50, 60% people go to the arts. So here we recognize this, but the heart is not yet quite in the right place where the arts is concerned, and that's why people are not attending yet. And on the other hand, there are people who said they're not interested in arts, but they still do go attend the arts, either because they've been dragged by significant others, or really, there was at that moment something that they just had to do. It's like fear of missing out. Okay, so what lies, I suppose, ahead for us in terms of the COVID study? Just looking at the online arts consumption, we saw that the engagement in arts and culture rise from 75% that was in the 2019 population survey to 88% in the COVID study. So almost everyone, except one single person, was doing some arts thing online. And for us in Singapore, it was there was a little brouhaha over the fact that artists were not considered essential workers. But if you look at this type of data where people, almost everyone was assessing the arts, it tells you that really artists are essential to the entire landscape, not just of the arts. So when people could return to workplaces after the lockdown restrictions eased, that was in October 2020, we saw the online consumption, digital figures come down a little bit from 78 percent to 78% from the 88%, but still a very high percentage. Right. And the latest dipstick we have is a little uptick to 82%. So as I said, I think in all, we have set out of a good base, recognizing from in 2002, some of you might not have been born then, we had like just 1 in 3 Singaporeans going to the arts, to now flipping over to the other side, 2 in 3 Singaporeans going to the arts. Okay, I'll give Chris a little bit of airtime first before I wax eloquent about the arts.
I mean, we could go on obviously because there's so many questions that arise from there. But yes, over to you, Chris, to kind of talk about the situation in Australia.
Yeah, thanks. Similarly, our arts attendance has continually increased throughout these series of surveys and through other studies that are done in Australia, or other surveys undertaken by the likes of the Australian Bureau of Statistics. They do a broader cultural attendance survey, and they release figures for 2017-18 that are also increasing. In terms of results, in our latest study, arts attendance was increasing across all art forms in our study. I suppose looking at who's attending, younger Australians and parents with young children have particularly strong attendance, we found. And I suppose that highlights, that addressing well-being and child development and future success of Australia in terms of how people engage with the arts. Attendance is also very high among First Nations respondents and cultural way and linguistic diverse respondents also. There's also the argument that it could be down to an increased number of arts events being available and accessible to some, not all. There's certainly been a growing number of arts and culture festivals in Australia in recent years, from large multi-art form festivals to small local free music festivals. So that could play a part in some communities accessing the arts. And we know that Australians enjoy a variety of arts experiences. So in the report, we have a graphic and some comment around the overlap in arts experiences. So we know that if a person goes to, for instance, music, they're very likely to attend visual arts or other art forms also. So that could play a part in it as well. And attendance figures, are a key sort of fact in understanding perhaps funding for the arts, or one of the main indicators in terms of, although the results of the study cover much more than our funded arts activity. It's a broad survey scope. These can inform policy decisions or other things that governments may introduce around specific support mechanisms for the arts as well. So attendance is a vital measure to keep tracking as we continue these surveys. I'll talk a little bit about we've got this COVID-19 audience outlook monitor that we developed and worked. It was run by two agencies, pattern makers here in Australia, in conjunction with Wilf Brown, a US research agency. And that looked at behaviours and sentiments during the pandemic of arts audiences. So it's important clarification to make here. These are lists of people who are audience members of participating organisations. That's what that study gives us, whereas our study in the National Arts Participation Survey terms is a general population study. But still, there's lots of interesting findings there about people willing to return to arts events when possible. We tracked that at 3 phases throughout 2020. And the last phase was conducted in September. So the results from that show that people have returned to events, but the picture is very different across Australia. I think you mentioned earlier, Charlene, just the difference in terms of restrictions in different states and territories and rates of community transmission and in terms of the COVID virus is very different. We're in a good position now, but there's still very uncertain times ahead in terms of attendance. So the people are willing to return, and I think comfort levels are increasing. That's something we've seen through that study, over the last year, with a lot of venues implementing social distancing guidelines and the wearing of face masks and sanitizers being available. All of these safety measures really contribute to people returning to events.
Thank you both. In a way, what you're dealing with, and I'm going to use a phrase that's not often used for the arts, but really is what you're talking about, it's climate change. And you're looking at the broad spectrum, but you're also looking at particular impact or particular change and consequence, right? And this, of course, has relationship with systemic change that occurs. And because you're involved in advising policy and working towards more positive outcomes while attending to some of the not so positive reflections that emerge, I'd like you to say a little bit about then what are the gaps you identify when you respond to this material. One of the things that you've hinted at is, of course, the shift in behaviors towards a digital because of a certain pandemic and how that affects people. But you're also talking about age factors, right? 15 and above and younger people. And yet, what about those under 15 who are potentially among those who are being dragged along, like you say, Sharon? They may not be interested initially, but then maybe they become interested later on. People who have access because of proximity to events and distances, which in Australia, of course, is hugely significant because of the scope of things. So systemic changes and how this ongoing change, I mean, you talked about bushfires, Chris, and that is a very direct outcome of a specific kind of climate change, but the impact of that in the material and how people are responding. What are your thoughts on that? Maybe I'll ask Chris first now.
Yeah, it's a great question. I think it's something we're very aware of in terms of the responses and results we've seen in this survey, and also in the COVID research in terms of the willingness to return and how things will have changed in terms of there was a pretty huge shift to online, in the height of the pandemic last year. So is that a sustainable model for artists and arts organisations going forward? You know, a lot of offerings are a hybrid model now of an in-person and a digital experience, and that's certainly something we'd like to explore in more detail. And I think as we run, we're going to continue to track these trends by running the Outlook Monitor again in 2021, just to track any key events as things change. You know, outbreaks may pop up again, hopefully not, but you know, border restrictions in Australia, because the difference between states and territories is really important. So how can you effectively, say, plan a tour or plan works across state borders at this stage? Is, you know, there's a lot of further conversation that needs to happen there. So I think, yeah, there's lots to think about, but that sort of what audiences are looking for in terms of the hybrid approach of in-person and digital. We need to explore the digital angle in more detail and, you know, through a different lens this year. And the main thing, I suppose, on that as well is to ensure that business models and, you know, monetized strategies are in place for organizations or artists who are putting on performances and presentations, ensuring they're appropriately paid for these live streamed events or digital productions.
Sharon.
Okay, because I'm an economist and I like to deal with long-term stuff first. So let me answer that from the question where we ask people what were the barriers to attending the arts. So in Singapore, we once thought and we once hypothesized that cost was a top barrier to attending the arts, that people, because we are quite a young nation relatively, and that it was more important for us to spend on needful items like, you know, food and shopping and Netflix. No, I'm joking. Compared to, you know, going to the arts. But surprisingly, cost was not the top barrier, but instead it was about the lack of familiarity with artists and performers. So what it says to us is that, you know, because Singaporeans are really tied for time, the business of life in a urban metropolis. So people want that value for money. And because they haven't got time to, you know, search for, you know, and really be comfortable with that event or that genre, then it goes like, okay, let me not do it, because I can always go to the museum. You know, that there will always be arts events. So that's one reason I think people are not you know, as the engagement is not as high in Singapore as in other countries. You talked about systemic, you know, sort of systemic factors, and so, you know, what has come out clearly to us as well is that, you know, because we use psychographics to try to understand whether instead of live stages, there were tribes that were consuming the arts. And what we found were interesting, that at one end of the spectrum, there were the culture vultures. These are the people who love the arts. Don't have to incentivize them, don't have to change any policies. They will, because they are so passionate about it, go for arts, whether or not it's expensive. But these people have like narrower interests. Then there are the people who are, you know, they like the arts, but they also need something, you know, more exciting. They like the Instagram opportunities. They like the sort of big bang, the hype associated with that. So these two groups, we are happy with them because they are converts. But we have three other segments. In the middle segment are those who are married with children, you know, and they are worried, you know, that, you know, number one, if they invested time, they might not get, as I said, the value for the time invested. And although cost is not a top barrier, but if you think about taking the entire family to, say, a musical, that can come out, you know, to quite a bit. And then at one other extreme is that, you know, people who say, you know, I have no interest in arts, I have no intention to go to the arts, and nothing can drag me to the arts. Okay, just moving to the COVID surveys, this particular segment, we found some of them had been assessing the arts as well digitally, right? And they didn't realize that, hey, they have been attending like neighborhood concerts, which were the arts, but it just the word arts was not anathema, was a little foreign to them. So what it says to us, I think, as a government, is that there has to be this continuous investment in arts in the neighborhoods. So if people are not coming to the arts, bring the arts and culture to the people. So there has to be continuous investment in that. And the other factor is, people have certain perceptions about the words arts and culture. There has to be that continuous, push from policy-wise, from investment-wise in education. We found from our surveys that someone who had been exposed to arts as a child below 12 was 3 times as likely to continue his participation and engagement in adulthood. And so, I suppose not just from the government in terms of providing activities in schools, but also for arts groups to reach out, to always have a youth arm, a child's arm, to reach out to this parents and children to bring them in. And then the sort of I spoke about the sort of people married with children and people who never touch the arts, and typically they tend to be lower with lower incomes. I don't know why they're over indexing on the male part. Maybe it's not cool for males to say they like the arts, right? And in between, they are the sort of retirees. I suppose coming from a sort of cost perspective, then retirees have to be a little more frugal with their expenditure. So although it's not a top barrier, and it sometimes gets hidden with, I'm not familiar with the artist, so I might not want to pay. So the continued provision of, I suppose, free stuff through like our entrance to museums and as I mentioned, neighborhood and arts performances, whether it's a shopping malls, whether it's community centers, that continues to be big policy priorities for us.
Thank you. Yeah, sorry, Chris, you wanted to say something.
Yeah, I'd just like to pick up on one of the points similarly to what Sharon was saying there. In one of our attitudinal statements, one of our findings, one of them is the arts are not really for people like me, and that's one we've been tracking for a number of years. So while the majority of attitudes are very positive throughout the survey, there's a slight increase again in the proportion of Australians that agree the arts are not really for people like me. So I do think there is something around the narrow perception of the arts and maybe using the phrase the arts. And interestingly, in the study for the attitudinal questions, this time we ran a split sample, and back to a bit of methodology at the beginning. We ran a split sample and used the standard phrases, the arts are not really for people like me, or changed it to cultural and creative experiences are not really for people like me, or activities that are important for education as opposed to the arts important. But interestingly, there was little to no difference across most of those. We know from focus groups and other call research that we've run over the years that there is, there's something in there about that language and how people perceive it, but it didn't seem to flow through in the results. In the results of this survey, the impact of language. It's definitely something we continue to investigate, and it's actually one of the key strategies in the Australian Council corporate plan is shifting that perception of the arts over the next 5 years based on national arts.
Yeah, very interesting, because language does make a huge difference. We know this from a range of different circumstances. And in a way, the profiling, that's another term that's often used for crime, but nonetheless, I think what you're doing is in a way profiling, right? These particular sectors, which are more porous, obviously, than we make them out to be in, research approaches. But nonetheless, the questions of access, the questions of education, the questions of affordability are related to specific behaviors and specific perceptions of self and specific perceptions of success. What does it mean, as you were saying, Sharon, to now be able to afford certain things and then realize, no, this is essential. This is part of my being a human being. And, what you're saying, Chris, about how then things get related to differently depending on the languages, and yet perhaps what's happening is a semiotic change and not so much a behavioral change. I mean, it's complex what emerges and how it is interpreted. And perhaps this is a good time to bring in Jade and Tong, and I'm going to ask them to turn on their screen. Tong works at the Singapore National Arts Council and is currently the Director of Sector Development of the Visual Arts and is helming Singapore Art Week at the moment. We're very glad to have him here. Jade Lillie is a leader, executive, facilitator, and specialist in community engagement at the Australia Council. Welcome to you both. Many things have emerged in the discussion thus far, and your work is to take this material, or aspects of it anyway, and really then translate it into work on the ground, into particular programs, into particular ways in which you engage with artists and audiences, funding, and a range of other sectors. So if you could speak to how you are responding to this material, as well as how you see its value, if not its problems, when you are working on the ground. We'll start with Tong and then move to Jade. Over to you, Tong.
Right. Hi, good morning, everyone. And thank you, for having me. I was hoping that Jade will go first so that I could actually kind of bounce off her.
Okay.
Okay. No, this is okay. It's okay.
It's okay.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. There's no prepared speech at the moment. So here it goes. Well, actually, every time I approach a survey, right,
Well, we're having a little bit of technical difficulty, so I think it is over to you, Jade, because Tong has suddenly frozen and he's had a little bit of tech earlier. So Jade, if you could please start the ball rolling. Over to you.
No problem. Hello, everyone. Thanks so much for having me here today. I'm joining you from Jajawarong country in regional Victoria in Australia. Yeah, it's great to be here with you. There's so much to say, I guess, and like Tong, I haven't got a prepared speech, but there's so many things that we consider on a daily basis about the way that we understand the new world that we're operating in. One of the things that COVID-19 has done is completely disrupt all of the kind of thinking and doing, the patterns of behaviour, the ways of working that we've all experienced over the last decades. Right, Tong, do you want to jump in, or are you good?
Well, I have technical issues, so I just missed all that Jade said. I'm so terribly sorry.
That's all right, Tong. We'll keep going with Jade, I think. We'll let Jade continue and then come back to you in a while, yeah? So please carry on, Jade.
So one of the things we've been watching carefully through the Audience Outlook Monitor is not simply about how audiences are responding necessarily, or how organisations can shift and change, but actually the confidence levels of communities and artists and people to actually participate. So it's one thing to be open, it's another thing to have people participate and attend. And those two things need to be considered alongside each other. Just because we're ready to go and present activities or festivals or events doesn't necessarily mean that it will be a sellout experience or something that people are confident to arrive at. From a sector point of view, which is really the key work that I do and the team that I work with, is really to understand how we can support the creative and cultural industries in and across Australia to grow and develop and change, in fact transform as a result of what we would call a reckoning, something that has completely leveled the experience, has provided more access and opportunity for people in ways that they haven't been able to participate before, whether that be digitally, remotely, regionally, in person, or in fact a combination of all of these things. And for us, that's really about how we understand what the future of the industry is and how we get there. So a lot of the work we've been doing recently is asking people that question. In 10 years' time, what is the type of industry we want to create? And so we've just finished a big national consultation in that. And now it's our job to really understand that very long list of actions and how we plan to implement them. I've been describing it as the best and most exciting work plan I've ever had, to understand a 10-year lens on how to transform and support the industry to do that, what those key actions are and where we go from here. It's not all going to happen immediately. Some of it will, some of it already has. But then what is our role in really initiating, facilitating, supporting and enabling communities, everybody, and particularly those who perhaps haven't had the platforms and the opportunities as much as others. How do we really do that moving forward? And that, for me, is our work is very much in the gaps between, you know, prioritising First Nations communities, for example, in all of our work and practices, and that being something we talk about, this is something we actually embody and do. Or artists and the precarity of artists and the fact that our artists, of which without we don't have an industry, are the most vulnerable and some of the most marginalised and have the most precarity, as we've seen through the COVID experience. How do we change that and make sure that artists are more secure, supported, and able to practice in a more long-term and ongoing way? And our work very much being in the gap between that as a concept and that as a reality.
Yeah, no, thank you, Jade. I think key words that jump out at me is this word reckoning, and how that leads into a particular kind of understanding of a consultation compared to a survey, right? A different kind of engagement to conversationally bring about new understandings, and therefore the facilitation, confidence of communities rather than thinking about individuals, different ways in which that profiling happens. Tong, over to you.
Yeah, I actually, you know, I like very much what Jade said, right? Because in the work that I do specifically, is really about the visual arts ecosystem as well. And along the way, you know, I get the opportunity to put together the Singapore Art Week and various other kind of programs. So I think, you know, whenever I look at a survey, like the two that Sharon mentioned, the most recent survey, which was very much from the lens of the audience perspective or the man in the street perspective, I look at two things. One, or what I'm kind of focused on, is that the survey would then help me or help us at the Arts Council to tell us what we are doing right and what we can do better, one. And two, I'm very much interested in what a survey can tell us about moving forward and looking ahead. Because I think all surveys, we must always put it into the context. It's about that moment when the survey is being done. So let me segue a little bit to what I mean. So for example, you know, there's this big conversation about whether the arts or the artist is essential. That survey that was done by a particular main newspaper and here in Singapore. But if you think about it, it's actually at that moment when the survey was made, when we were in the thick of the COVID-19 situation, we're in a circuit breaker. So topmost in everybody's mind is about getting well, right? So the healthcare sector were the ones who felt that they were the most essential. So, you know, in reading survey results, we often need to look at context. Back to the main topic on hand, what I like particularly what Jade said is what the Arts Council here is doing. It is about the continuing engagement with the arts community. We've done a lot of that since COVID-19 happened. And through the engagement that we've made, we are constantly in responding to what is needed in terms of the arts community and moving forward. So for those of us who are living here and knowing the work that the council does, we have the very significant downloading of resources of about 55 million under the Arts and Culture Resilience Package, where actually a lot of resources have been put into ensuring, number one, topmost, the livelihood sustainability for the artists and the arts community and the arts organizations, including commercial art galleries to some small, to a lesser extent. And at the same time, also upskilling and capability development. So that is the immediate. But the engagement that we have done over the last few months and the past year is actually now propelling us to think forward, right? I'm sure my colleagues will be able to tell you there will be new thinking, new policy, new programs coming up, but very much concerned about the future, as Jade has so eloquently articulated in the work that all of the arts councils around the world is doing. Yeah. So it's,
yeah, no, thank you. I wanted to ask you both if you could then say a little bit about, what you are reading in relation to the particular kinds of struggles. Jade, you use the word confidence, right? And clearly there are certain kinds of struggles that artists are feeling at this point, certain vulnerabilities, certain precarities, and also people who feel that, no, the arts is not the most relevant thing, but nonetheless, I want something, these struggles of perception, which are captured in a particular way in the survey, but in your face-to-face contact and in your, in a way, relationship with the people that you're working with and the landscapes that you're working with, what emerges for you as significant and often overlooked, I guess is what I'm trying to understand. Jade?
Thanks, Charlene. There's a couple of things that come to mind throughout the last 12 months, really been thinking about how there has been kind of three schools of thought, if you like. There's been a group of people who are just not sure how to even imagine what next week looks like, let alone next year, or even next month. There's another group that really, and when I say group, I talk about people in the industry primarily, who know that this is an opportunity and want to really think about that, but don't really know how, have the capacity or the resources to do so. And then there's a third group which identify, as I said, the kind of reckoning, the nature of transformation, the ready to completely deconstruct and rebuild, and actually are ready to go, but just need some support to do that, and perhaps be brought together in a particular way to do so, or are self-organising and doing that themselves. So that's sort of one of the things that I've really noticed. And then the other thing that happened through the sector consultation process, we held some sessions with what we call collaborators, so allied industries, health, education, engineering, tech, community development, and so on. And I asked the people at those particular sessions, what is the problem that arts and culture can solve for your industry? And everybody talked about things like collective meaning making, compassion, empathy, belonging, identity, meaning making, processing of collective trauma, all of these very important social, cultural, and political contexts. And I thought to myself, no wonder we have a difficult time measuring the impact of arts and culture. But even in all of those allied sectors, people do have the language for what creativity and culture offers children, young people, families, and communities. But how do we actually bring all of those things together and have people really own and drive the way that creativity and culture shapes, narrates, and provides opportunity for a collective experience of our world as we know it? So those are really the things that keep coming back around.
Yeah, good reminders that, people do have the language to speak their need when the need emerges. And as the need becomes more urgent, I guess we do become clearer in certain respects. Tong, your thoughts?
Jade, my God, it sounds exactly like Singapore as well. So we have the same observations, the three things, right? The three groups of people who don't really know what's going to happen for them the day they live from day to day, those in the industry, and then to that range of the arts organizations and individuals who are just so ready to go, right? To take on the challenge and to, in a way, transform themselves. And I think that, taking on board, and then very similarly, we are also beginning to talk to auxiliary, kind of like industries and other sectors, is a way we are actually be working much closer with these industry. There's a separate piece of work that I'm kind of doing and thinking a little bit about, is that how do we then get the arts more involved in the day-to-day operations of a corporation, whereby the arts, the artists and their creativity is a way embedded into the day-to-day running operations of corporations. But that's a little bit farther down the road. And so with these kind of like kind of like responses and what we're hearing very much on the ground, and I really marvel at my NAC colleagues who really do that work very much in the last few months, very intense, is that how then do we craft the next, perhaps another, program or package, which would then answer all these questions, and how do we then actually create programs or in such a way that would then support the different strands in this very diverse and complex arts ecosystem that all of us are working in and living in. So I can't say too much about that at the moment, but there is definitely a lot of work going in there. And for those of us who are living in Singapore and my colleagues in the arts community, do rest assured that whatever feedback that you've been giving myself and my colleagues over the last 12 months are taken very seriously and then kind of like processed, and then to see how we can then move forward. But I think that what is very important is that in the work of the National Arts Council, I think that there is a need for us to actually, on both ends, to actually find ways, to actually have a greater kind of like level of communication, right? And to actually have that sense that, here we are trying to create solutions together or to problem solve, be it short term, middle term, or long term. But they have that sense of the understanding that, is really about, working together and landing on a particular point. Council would not be able to do everything. We will need to actually work very well collaboratively with our partners, with various organizations and individuals from the arts community and the auxiliary ecosystem to come to some kind of progress and moving forward, right? Yeah.
Thank you both. There's much to dwell on there, but in essence, I think one of the key things is how to improve the conversation. And I'm going to start by asking Chris and Sharon to jump into this conversation now and respond to what you're hearing both Jade and Tong saying in relation to that sense from the ground that is somewhat different when one looks at data compared to when one is hearing voices. Although there is a combination, there's not a straightforward delineation. It's on a spectrum, one might say. But what emerges for you? Chris, Sharon, yeah, Sharon.
Okay, I'll go first. So many big questions there. So I'll deal with it, and some of that appears in the sort of chat box as well. So I'm going to address Jade's sort of remark about how we could measure how arts produces compassion and empathy and all that. I'll start with a very tongue-in-cheek comment. It's like if arts is about, or we know arts is about the soul and all that, right? But how do you measure soul? Exactly. So what we're trying to do is, you have noticed, is try to get at an approximation of this by saying, the arts helps me understand people better. There's a bit of compassion, empathy. So that's through our service, and that's the exact reason why we try to put some of these statements in. But I recognize really that as the sort of scene changes, as people get used to different sort of platforms, instruments, that the big challenge really is for us, even as researchers, to make sure that we are tracking the right things so that we're giving the right data to our colleagues. Someone asked the question in the chat box, is there a need to differentiate between access and participation, attendance, and all that? Okay, so a little bit of a history lesson. So we sort of inherited this sort of, I suppose, the lingo from the granddaddy of all arts councils, the Arts Council England. And where at one time, I think that the construct was that attendance is really a passive sort of engagement in the arts. You just go to an arts event, and if you were sort of like driven and motivated to just go beyond dipping your little toesies in, it would be participation. Then you'll be going for, talks, workshops, you'll be entering competitions. But when it comes to the digital world, so how do you differentiate between just watching something and, being sort of engrossed in that, in the performance that you're seeing online? So what we have done continue to do in the Arts Council is that we recognize that there is still value in asking people specifically whether they're just attending versus participating, because they speak to certain programs that we're developing at the Arts Council. And when it comes to digital, we just say, engagement, because, even for you to download something, to watch something, to search or something, there's already a deeper participation. So we use that terminology, but we recognize that there is this, we see the data, there is this continuous porosity among these different sort of modalities. So at one time we thought, that people start by first attending, then they will participate, and then they will sort of like be interested and they donate. And then yet the data is telling us that, interest really is the thing that sparks it, but yet it cannot be divorced. So it's sort of like a bi-directional sort of relation between attending and exposure. So it's all very complex, but we're all living in complex systems. But just to answer the question, we are cognizant of the differences in the sort of levels of engagement, and we track and we continue to ask people, have deeper conversations to see, what are the different outcomes of these various ways that people are accessing the arts.
Chris, your thoughts?
Completely agree with what Sharon was saying there. I mean, in our survey, we look at all of those impacts and attitudinal statements. So particularly those ones around social connection, on the ground, why are people attending these arts events? So we introduced a new question to look at the motivations in more detail this time. And the top one was to have fun or to be entertained. That was the number one motivation, but there are some deeper connections there. So to socialize with others, to understand perspectives that are different to your own. So there's these types of, I suppose, deeper values that we like, that we'd like to explore in more detail. We are doing, interestingly for us, there is, and I think in an earlier answer, Sharon, you touched on it, there is somewhat contradictory behaviour from a lot of people who, may hold really positive attitudes towards the arts, but don't necessarily attend, and vice versa, those that attend, but don't necessarily hold such positive attitudes. So those segments are definitely of interest to us to find out, and explain barriers and motivations in more detail. We're trying, at the moment, we're developing some further statistical tools that may help the industry, the Australia Council, but the industry more broadly, to try and understand those differences, or to better understand those motivations and barriers. We report them in our main study, but we're trying to develop some just slightly more sophisticated tools that the sector can use to look at that. So I think they're really important aspects to look at. And one, it reminds me of the going back to 2016, in terms of First Nations arts, it also helps us identify research that should be undertaken. So we have questions in our survey around interest in First Nations arts and attendance at First Nations arts. So there was that gap there. So lots of people were interested in First Nations arts, but it didn't translate into actively attending First Nations arts. So that sort of thinking resulted in a suite of First Nations, a dedicated First Nations research that we carried out over the last few years, looking at audiences, presenters, and creators as well. So those type of things, the gaps between interest and attendance is interesting to delve into in more detail, more generally.
Yeah, thank you. I think that, is already beginning to respond to one of the questions that is coming up, and we are moving into the time for Q&A, responding to questions that has come up, and that is the relationship between policy and research on a granular level as on a wonderful level. The relationship that emerges in shifts in policy, some of which you have addressed briefly, and also the shifts that then emerge as a result of the push from the ground, which is what Jade and Tong are involved very directly in discerning, because there are many demands. We make many demands of life, and so we should. But nonetheless, the work of discerning what is urgent, what is crucial, what is perhaps unspoken and yet crucial is sometimes really hard as well, and in alignment with the larger picture. So if you could say a little bit about how perhaps the surveys have led to tweaks in thinking about policy, working through policy, and Jade and Tong, I mean, I meant that more for Sharon and Chris, but Jade and Tong, how policy then gets implemented, because at another level, policy remains quite distant. Yet everyday life is affected by policy, and even in the disbursement of funding, for example, and the selection of who is entitled or who is eligible. I mean, these are really complex and sensitive issues that get, felt and sometimes not articulated. So I'll ask Sharon and Chris first to talk about this relationship that you see between policy and the research on a granular level, and then ask Jade and Tong to respond after that.
Okay, I'll jump in with a quick one because this sort of comes out from the COVID survey. So we recognize that, digital is such an important medium, putting aside first cannibalization and all that. Happy to have a conversation about that if you want. But we recognize that, Singapore is like almost everyone's on either a mobile or on the computer or a laptop or an iPad. And so, for our artists to sustain their arts practice during such times and even going into the future, it was important for them to have these competencies. So very quickly, off the back of the COVID support that the government has put in place, there was the Arts Council launched the digital presentation grant, really to, number one, get our artists to, still continue that practice by putting things online, as well as to build up that capacity, right, to produce, besides the live performances, a mobile-friendly or online friendly version. So that's one small example.
Okay, thank you, Sharon. Chris?
Yeah, I suppose more broadly, our research agenda informs policy. You have to continue to build the evidence base for the arts, and particularly council's advocacy activity. That's key for us across all of our research. I think it's, in terms of specific policy outcomes, we can only provide the evidence that allows informed conversation to happen. And I think it's really important. What we've tried to do, I think at Council, and Jade can help with this as well, is have more of those conversations cross-industry as well. So we're not just talking amongst ourselves, really, within our own departments or our own sort of government agencies, but we can see from the National Arts Participation Survey results and other research, we've done some research on tourism, we can see the impacts of arts and culture in all of these areas. So we need to keep having informed conversations with the tourism sector, health, education, and just make sure that arts and culture and the evidence is robust and at the forefront of all of these conversations. And that, hopefully can influence some change, or think about then informing policy decisions further down the line. But a council has used the audience outlook monitor that was run here to inform decisions for strategy over the last year, and I know it's been used by Australian arts organisations as well, to when they're thinking about when they were thinking about reopening their doors, and the appetite for digital content, and all of the different elements of that study really helped with their strategies. So I think it's more about continually building that evidence base. We can't have enough research to continually beat the drum of the value of the arts.
Yeah, and it's different kinds of research, as you're saying, different ways in which material becomes meaningful. Jade, in terms of how that impacts the work that you're doing on a day-to-day basis in translating and making policy real.
I think probably there's lots of ways that we implement and in fact influence policy, and stepping back from a kind of formal policy environment, whether it's designing an initiative, whether it's developing a framework or making a strategic decision, this research really helps to bolster and enable all of that too. So I think together, all those things ultimately have the potential or the opportunity to influence policy. In a very real way, the Audience Outlook Monitor and associated kind of research done around the COVID period has really helped us to make the case not only to the industry about the various things people need to consider and think about as they start to imagine what their next steps are, but also in speaking to the Australian Health Protection Principles Committee, for example, who actually are the key decision makers from a health perspective at a federal level, and work with all of the different industries to decide how and when, and the chief health officers, how and when we're able to move forward in a COVID context. So one of the things we've been really having to do is talk to the AHPPC about the depth and breadth of activity across the industry, because, you know, there's an incredible amount of difference in our industry as much as there are similarities. So using that research and evidence to say, and this is the experience across these types of organisations, these art forms, these artists, overlaid by the fact that in Australia at least, the decision-making power, particularly in a COVID context, and the type of change or different steps that we might be going through is divested to the jurisdiction. So each state and territory are the decision makers in that context. So you could have a federal plan, but actually it's up to the states and territories as to how and when, and in fact, if they engage with that plan on a local level. So one of the things we've done is work with all of the states and territories to bring them together to share resources and to share ideas as well as challenges and solutions. And this research also helps us to do that. So in some ways, I think the best research has impacts that you just can't even imagine where they get to. We won't see always the impacts of this research. It'll go on and on and on in multiple ways and directions, but rest assured that it does inform all of the decisions that we make and others make too.
Thank you. Tong.
Yeah. You know, this thing, I like what Sharon said earlier on, porosity across the modalities, right? And I think that, you know, what we have been talking about this morning and from my own personal experience working in the council, is that it's really about that sense of duality or more, whereby the research gives us the very kind of like scientific data, and then the engagement on the ground is just giving you a sense of the ground feel. And then for the work that we do in the sector, we need to look at the both. You need to see both sets of feedback, if you want, you know, research the data as well as what we're hearing on the ground. How do they coincide, or how do they depart from each other? And I think that in that way, we need to make some kind of a judgment call, right? You can't be 100% sure. And you make a kind of a judgment call on how to create new initiatives, or how do you even begin to write a new set of policies. And then for us in the sector, a lot of times we are very much involved in the writing of that policy and the thinking behind the policy. We give our feedback. We give very direct contributions to our colleagues who writes out these policies, and then later on is then implemented. But implementation It will always depends on what it is. Some are much easier and straightforward, minor tweaks to what the existing programs are. Others are new initiatives. And it takes the entire council, it's just not me in visual arts sector alone, but it takes the entire council to communicate that new thinking, that new policy, and where it hopes to make a difference, a resonance. So how I approach research or the data research is get the evidence of, like I said earlier, what we've been doing right, or what needs to be improved upon, and how can we then look a little bit into the future. And definitely, like what Jade said, research, the best kind of research is when you have very unexpected resonance and results. You never know the kind of impact it has, because the research that the council does is shared with the community. So and therefore the community themselves have the same equal access to information. And the question is that then how then do our community, our arts organization also leverage on the research that the council has done, right? And then come back to work together with the council to move forward, because we're in it as one together. And I think that any kind of progression or moving forward needs all of us to be in it together and to formulate some kind of, co-create some kind of a path forward, right?
Yeah, lots of synergies that need to be acknowledged in the way in which things actually happen in real life. I'm going to take, were you wanting to say something, Sharon? Yes.
I just want to add a comment. Yeah. I think the other bit about, using data to help our artists is really, this is nugget, which was people say who have gone into both previous non-digital users as well as digital users, that what really drew them to arts consumption during COVID period was looking for novelty, something new they hadn't seen, something they wanted to learn, and something that they couldn't access in normal times. So we went to the Esplanade and we said, go spread the word out, and that if people are putting things out, and now they have a bigger audience, right? They have the world audience rather than just in Singapore. You really have to, amp up this aspect of your work, which is what's new about it, because there's really now, digital is good, it opens up markets, but it also means that it intensifies the competition.
Yeah. Okay, I'm going to move on to a question that's a specific question, but for Singapore, but I think it might relate to the situation in Australia as well. I'm just going to read it out, right? So the question reads, do we differentiate between consumption of and attitude towards arts events by local arts groups versus foreign touring arts productions? Looking at the NAC Singapore survey, it seems like there isn't a distinction between the two, or perhaps the data set is collected from surveys of NAC-funded productions. Apologies if I missed any prior clarification on this, says the questioner. Anecdotally, here in Singapore, the questioner seems to see quite different attitudes towards homegrown music productions, and perhaps the arts in general, homegrown, versus touring commercial productions from non-local artists. It would be interesting to pinpoint the factors that lead to this behavior attitude. So your responses to this concern and this particular relationship between what is local and non-local.
Okay. We do ask people, but it's quite difficult because you're asking about people's, for the population survey, because you're asking people whether they have consumed at least one, engaged in arts in one of the many art forms over the last 12 months. And then to pinpoint, did you watch local or international? So what was the last one, or was it on average? So that's why we generally don't release data about local and international. But in the COVID survey, we did ask people whether they access what they thought was local works or international works. And that does seem to be a preference for international work. But interestingly, when people said they would pay, they said they would pay for the local production rather than for the international one. So the COVID brought out this sense of patriotism, not xenophobia, but patriotism in wanting to support the arts sector in a very difficult time.
Chris, is that something that emerges in the Australian context?
The answer is very similar to what Sharon just said. Yeah, we don't delve into that in our National Arts Participation Survey in terms of local or international content. It's broad questions about art forms and engagement with types of art. So we can't really do any results in that way. But in the audience outlook monitor, the COVID-19 impact surveys throughout last year, there are some comments and some anecdotal evidence that being able to discover new works is vital for people, what it was last year. And also just the availability of the world opening up to Australian audiences. But it does have a similar output to what Chan asked about paying for online experience and the reasons for paying. And it did come through fairly strongly that people wanted to support Australian artists and arts organisations in these difficult times. So I can't remember the exact proportion who were paying for online experiences, but a lot of them were doing it just to support the local arts economy.
Well, the next question is, the sense is a follow-on from that, Chris. And question is, I lived in Sydney for 3 years, and my impression is that there is greater government direct funding support per capita for the arts in Singapore relative to Australia, presuming this person lived in Singapore before. Do you think this is accurate? And if so, how do you think the difference in approach or policy has affected the growth of the industry or the public's perception, engagement with the arts? Do you think such policies should adapt and change post-pandemic, and how? How do you make sense of that? Since there is, invariably this comparison contrast when we set up a webinar like this, is there a significant difference? And if so, is it a difference that can be captured this way, or is the difference actually got to be seen contextually in a slightly different way or significantly different way?
Yeah, I think it would have to be seen in a slightly different way. In terms of the direct, I'm not entirely across the funding situation in Singapore in comparison to what's happening in Australia. But all I can say is that in terms of informing those decisions and policy, again, is advocating for the value of the arts. That's why we do this research ultimately, is to continue to build that evidence base and advocate for the value of the arts. So if that results in conversations with funding agencies, and you have to remember it's a complex, as Jade mentioned, it's a complex sort of network of government levels here in terms of federal, state, territory have their own funding agendas, and local government as well, which some local governments have significant arts and cultural funding programs, but others not so much. So there's a real sort of different size and shape of arts funding across different levels of government and across Australia, really. So it's quite a difficult one. It's a very big question to try and interrogate. But from a research point of view, I mean, maybe Jade can speak a bit more to this, but from a research point of view, I'm just happy that we can continue to produce enough evidence to inform the conversation, and that hopefully at some stage will have an impact on funding decisions and availability of programs and initiatives.
We haven't taken into account purchasing power parity. Sorry to introduce such an economic word. So, things could be so much cheaper in Australia. So, compared to Singapore, like cars, housing,
I think the range of particularities that emerges will inform this discussion if we have more time, but we don't have much more time. And so I'm sorry that some of the questions that have emerged in the chat are not going to be addressed here. Perhaps you may get in touch with Australia Council or the NAC directly to ask them and engage with them. I'm sure they're more than happy to respond, particularly if it emerges out of this webinar. I am going to ask each panelist, though, on a final note, to say, okay, so what's your aspiration for research to be able to do next, which it hasn't yet done, that you've been thinking about, you would like to happen, particularly post-pandemic, when we can think of a post-pandemic, or even in this current phase of a new phase of the pandemic affecting our lives? What is it you'd like research to do? This is aspirational. This may not be something that you have the nitty and gritty for how it's going to happen yet, but I will start with Tong, Jade, Sharon, and then Chris. Tong?
That was a curveball you threw me. I'm still thinking about it. Charlene.
That's my joy as a moderator.
The joy. Hopefully I give you some joy with this response. Well, I think the aspiration and hope for any sort of research that we do, and for example, we are doing audience survey for Singapore, right? Really, to see how we can capture the context of that moment when the research is done, it's being made. It's not always easy, because I always feel that context, in where we're operating is so significant. So I'm just wondering how that could be feasible in any sort of survey, or aspire that maybe there's a way for us when reading the survey results is actually that context. Yeah.
Jade, your turn.
It's a huge question. Aspirationally, I would love to see the notions of research democratized and made more accessible and inclusive for everyone to feel like it's something that they can do, contribute to, and deliver. And I'd love to see people see themselves reflected in the people who are researching, the way that research is articulated, the language that's used, and how it impacts people.
Thank you, Sharon.
Okay, instead of answering what research does, I'm going to answer how to do research, right? Because I am a researcher. So if I had my way, I would implant every single Singaporean or every person in the world with a chip in the brain, in the heart, and in their limbs, so that I do not ever have to ask people, so that they're only stating and people question me as well, like, that's what they say, but are they really doing it, right? And if I had those 3 chips, then I would really know when your hands and legs are going to art venues and when your brain is transformed. So ultimately, your heart and soul are uplifted because of the arts.
I won't even begin. Chris, over to you.
Oh, wow, what an answer. Yeah, look, I think there's a lot that's come through from this latest study and a lot of conversations that are going on globally in terms of diversity and diverse voices coming through. I think there's a lot more research that we can do and be a leader in research in this area at the Australia Council. And of particular interest is some of the socio-economic inequalities, and some gaps continue to grow between communities. So that's that will be a focus, I think, for our research agenda going forward. And just touching on Jade's point as well, making research as accessible as possible to everyone, so they can understand the value of the arts. That's the bottom line.
Thank you so much. Now there's food for thought for another webinar when it happens. Thank you all. A round of applause to Chris and Sharon, Jade and Tong from the Australia Council, as well as the National Arts Council Singapore. We have to end the webinar here, but as indicated earlier, this has been recorded and will be available on the Arts Equator YouTube channel. Just to say again that this webinar has been organized by Arts Equator and supported by National Arts Council Singapore and Australia Council for the Arts. It is part of Singapore Art Week, which continues. So those of you in Singapore, please avail yourself of that program. And the reports from which much of these discussions arose are available online, and the access to them is open to the public. Thank you all for being part of this webinar. Wishing you a good day or evening ahead. See you soon. Goodbye.